So we're in 2 Corinthians and chapter 12, and we're going to look at a few verses, chapter 11 to verse 18, if we get all the way through that, which may seem strange, but maybe there's a detour here. We'll go along. Paul is ending in this last section, verses 11 to 13, what is called the fool's speech. And that goes back to all that he's given from chapter 10 to chapter 13, well, chapter 12, verse 13 to be specific, as he's dealing with what's gone on in Corinth and especially the false teachers that have come in and their style of approach. So they have come into the church. They seem to be relatively new. They come in, they're Jewish by background, they're Gentile in their style. They've adapted thoroughly to Greek style of rhetoric and all of these other things. And they come in claiming great things for themselves, and they've enticed a good part of the Corinthian congregation to pay attention to them. And Paul has felt a need to attack this as directly. It's one of the remarkable things about 2 Corinthians, and maybe you've felt it as we've gone on. We hear more about Paul as a man in this book than in any other, and you're going to feel it too in the passage we read tonight. He is distraught that all of this is necessary. It feels very unfair the way they have treated him. And there's sarcasm because he's speaking to try and disrupt their normal way of thinking and all of this. So what he's done, well, let's read verses 11 to 13 just to have those words in our mind, which really ends that section. I've been a fool. You forced me to it, for I ought to have been commended by you. For I was not at all inferior to these super apostles, his sarcastic term for them, even though I am nothing. The signs of a true apostle were performed among you without utmost patience, with signs and wonders and mighty works. For in what were you less favored than the rest of the churches? Except I myself didn't burden you. Forgive me this wrong. So, I just want to look at each of these three verses because they are all kind of interesting in terms of the larger story of the book and what is going on here. But this first one, when he says, I've been a fool. So let me backtrack. There's two words that have dominated since chapter 10, verse 1, especially chapter 11. And it's the word boasting and it's the word fool or foolishness. He uses the word boasting 19 times in these chapters because these people have come in as self-promoters, boasting in the style of the Greek rhetoricians. And somebody made a comment, and I thought it was very insightful, and it helps us get into it. We're living in a very different era. But in the ancient world, actually up until very recently, public speakers were one of the famous parts of entertainment in the ancient world. What were you going to do? You didn't have radio, you didn't have, well, you had a theater of a kind, of a very limited form of it. You had the games, and the Romans and the Greeks were big on all of those things. And rhetoricians, people gifted to oratory, were, as one person put it, they were the rock stars of that time. And there was a very distinguished way of doing it, very set out way if you were going to speak in that particular way. So they were sort of the rock stars, the Hollywood stars, the celebrities, and they came in, and style and substance was significant. And when somebody was good, he expected to be treated like a celebrity. And so there was boasting about themselves and flaunting themselves. They were their own PR people. Nowadays we have rock people or Hollywood stars, and they surround themselves with a whole celebrity retinue to make sure everybody knows how important they are. These people did it themselves. So boasting was a big part of this. And the Corinthians have been impressed by the things they claim. And Paul is pressured on this because it goes against everything within him to go against what he knows is the Lord. He said at the very beginning, I want to come to you with the gentleness and meekness of Christ. And Christ was no self-promoter. So he feels that pressure. And so there was on one side boasting, and on the other side, he considers all this an exercise in foolishness. So he uses the word foolish in one form or another 8 times in chapters 11 and 12. And so the boasting and the foolishness are kind of gone together. And so he's come to the end of this, and he says, I've been a fool. Because he doesn't like it. And he feels that he's been forced to this. So just to remind you, back in chapter 11 and verse 16, jumping into the conversation, he says, I repeat, that no one thinks me foolish. Even if you do, accept me as a fool, so I too may boast a little. And then he goes on to say, you're forcing me to this. I don't want to do it. But you are forcing my hand to boast, because they talked about their accomplishments and all of these other things. And then he comes back to that and he says, in verse 10, as the truth of Christ is in me, this boasting of mine will not be silenced in the regions of Achaia. So Achaia is Corinth and the area of Corinth and all around there. I'm going to boast. And then he goes on to talk about boasting, but in the midst of it, he's got 2 principles that guide him. One is, let him who boasts boast in the Lord. So the only reasonable boasting is to boast what the Lord's done through you. And Paul knows that they're wanting him to talk about himself in this particular way. And then in chapter 11, verse 30, he says, if I must boast, I'll boast of the things that show my weakness. So he takes up this sort of reverse style of boasting to boast about his misfortunes and his hardships and his difficulties. And when he does finally talk about a vision that he had, he pushes past that to say, and the Lord gave me a thorn in the flesh after I had that, to teach me to glory in my weakness, because when I'm weak, then I'm strong. So this is upside down boasting in that particular way. This talking all about myself. I'm not wanting to do that. I don't think that that's honoring to God in what I do it. So when he says now in verse 11, I've been a fool, but he's implied that they have been fools. First of all, the false teachers are fools for boasting and talking all about themselves and the stupidity of that kind of exercise of their own virtues and their own strengths. Secondly, the Corinthians have been fools in 2 ways, just remembering what he said in the past. First of all, by being impressed by the fools. So only a fool is impressed by a fool. So since they've been impressed by a fool, that makes them fools. The second thing is that they've accepted abuse from these people. So if you remember back in chapter 11, and I need to let myself figure this out. Where is it? He goes on and he talks about the fact, in verse 19, you gladly bear with fools, being wise yourselves, for if you bear it, if someone makes slaves of you, or devours you, or takes advantage of you, or puts on airs, or hits you in the face. So you've allowed these people to abuse you, and the suggestion is maybe even abuse them physically, because they boast to be so prominent, and you've let them push you around. So tell me who the fool is part of his answer to that, or what his suggestion is. I've been a fool, but you forced me to it. And what I've done is turn boasting upside down by boasting in my weaknesses and not my accomplishments. Now that's the first thing. But the second thing he says, and you've got to read this and understand, I ought to have been commended by you. And what he's saying is, you should have been praising me. I mean, the only reason you exist is because I came to you with the gospel. The only reason there's even a church is because I evangelized you. And when these people came in and to put themselves up, they put me down, and you allowed them to get away with the insults and the slanders and the misstatements in that particular way. And you ought to have been commending me. And it's a hard thing. Sometimes, probably all of you have been in a situation where someone you have helped, someone who you've worked with, for whatever reason, turned on you, and they owed you praise, even though you weren't asking for it, or thankfulness, and instead they began to spread rumors or say things or do things behind your back. And that's what Paul is, I should have been commended, but I wasn't. And then the third thing he says is, I wasn't in any way inferior to these super apostles. Now again, he's using that term, super apostles. He used it back in verse 11, and he's using it sarcastically. These people who think themselves to be super apostles. But what he's already said back in chapter 11 and verse 5, and then later, is they're not apostles at all. They're false teachers. And he's made that point. They aren't apostles of Christ. They are agents of Satan in what they are doing. But he backs away from making that particular statement there. So this verse 11 ends this statement on fools, and he'll leave that word beside now to basically say, okay, that's why I've been talking. I shouldn't have needed this. You should have been defending me. I've had at different times in my life, people come to me and say, you know what so-and-so is saying about you? And they seem to be quite glad to let me know what somebody else is saying about me. And the question I always want to ask, I usually restrain myself, is, and what did you say to them? Because they're coming to me to tell me they're saying false things, so I long to ask them, and did you defend me, or did you correct them, or did you just allow them to pour garbage into your ear and then just come and tell me about what they're saying? And that's where Paul is in this particular situation. So that's verse 11. Now he said, and raised this whole issue, I was not at all inferior to these super apostles, even though I'm nothing. Now what he's saying there is, it's not because I'm somebody that I'm an apostle. That's an act of God's grace. I'm not claiming that I'm an apostle because I'm something. I'm an apostle because God appointed me. And it is of his grace and of his mercy. It isn't because of my merit and my achievement and my activities. I didn't earn this, and he'll come back to this in a little bit later, but God entrusted it to me. So when you are criticizing me, you're in a certain sense criticizing the Lord who put me into this particular position. So having said that, now in verse 12, the signs of a true apostle were performed among you with utmost patience, or with utmost endurance. Endurance, to my mind, is there's two words in Greek. One is a word that means to have a long temper, macrothumia. We talk about people having a short temper, and we don't have a word for the opposite. But the Greek word is macrothumia. That's the word that should be translated patience. And it usually relates to people. Take a long time to get hot related to people. Endurance is a word, and it's the word that's translated here, patient, means to stay under difficult circumstances and move toward the goal. So if you had to make a distinction, you'd say one word talks about patience with people. The other looks at endurance in the midst of difficulty. And he's saying, I did these signs and wonders and miracles among you with much endurance. In other words, it was difficult circumstances and a difficult situation, and I did them. There's probably not much difference between the three words. Signs, wonders, and miracles probably are not three different kinds of actions, but three different effects. Signs mean they point to something greater. Wonders means they create awe. That's the effect on the person who's watching it. And powers, or miracles, but the word is powers, means there was a display of divine power in it. So it's probably the same thing. Now the interesting thing, or the same events that are talked about, the interesting thing is that in Acts, Paul records no miracles, Luke records no miracles that were done by Paul when he was in Corinth. So there's nothing of that in Acts chapter 18, but it's obvious he wouldn't be writing this unless there'd been a significant number of miracles that took place over the 18 months he was in the city and saw the church, but we know nothing of that. But I want to talk a little bit with you, or think a little bit with you, about the signs of an apostle. Because what he is claiming is, I have the credentials of an apostle. And in the New Testament, there are two primary, or three actually, primary credentials of an apostle. The first is that they needed to have seen the risen Christ. So in Acts chapter 1, if you remember, they're going to add an apostle to it, to their number. And they said they have to have been with us from the beginning, and they'd have to see the risen Christ. Acts chapter 1, verse 22, as they're going to add this extra one. And so they cast lots, and Matthias is included among the apostles at that point as someone who'd witnessed Christ and witnessed the risen Christ. But Paul clearly hadn't met that. He hadn't seen that experience. But 1 Corinthians chapter 9, and it's worth turning back there just to notice this. He says, am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? And are you not my workmanship in the Lord? So you could almost add another one there, but he had seen the Lord, but also, as we know in other places, he'd been commissioned by the Lord. And an apostle was not just somebody who'd witnessed, because there were 500 men at once who saw the risen Lord. The apostles were those who in some way had been commissioned by the Lord. And for Paul, that happened on the Damascus Road, and what followed up in Damascus afterwards, when he saw the risen Christ and was commissioned by the risen Christ. So he puts it like this. Talks about he was raised the third day in accordance with the scriptures, and he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, although they've fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James and to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born out of proper order, he appeared to me also. For I am the least of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. Now you'll notice he does two things there. He claims that he'd seen the Lord and that he was an apostle, but out of order. So he's the extraordinary apostle. He was an apostle, but an extraordinary one. So the first qualification was they'd had to seen the risen Christ. You probably could add they need to be commissioned to that task by the risen Christ. And the third one is what he talks about here: signs and wonders and powers and miracles. In Acts 7, Stephen is talking on that particular occasion to the crowd, and he's going to be, of course, stoned at the end of it, and Paul's going to be part of that. But in the midst of talking about it, he talks about Moses. And he says, about Moses, I need to look up my reference here. Yeah. Verse 36. This man led them out, performing wonders and signs in Egypt and at the Red Sea and in this wilderness for 40 years. So Moses did signs and wonders and was in that way, although it doesn't say it directly here, authenticated by the miracles he did. But back in chapter 2 of the book of Acts, Peter speaking on the day of Pentecost, men of Israel, hear these words, Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested to you by God with mighty works and signs mighty works and wonders and signs that God did through him in your midst, as you yourself know. So the miracles were in some way an attestation of who Jesus was as the Son of God. He was attested by God through the miracles that he did. And he himself says that, if you don't believe me for the very work's sake. The works that I do, the Father has given to me. And now Paul is saying, and if you look through the book of Acts, you have the term signs, wonders, and miracles, and they're done by the apostles, not exclusively, but nearly always in the book of Acts. And then now in 2 Corinthians, Paul uses that same language, but turn with me to Hebrews chapter 2. So Hebrews chapter 2, verse 1. Therefore, we must pay much closer attention to what we've heard, lest we drift away from it. For since the message declared by angels proved to be reliable, and every transgression or disobedience received a just retribution, how shall we escape if we neglect such a great salvation? That salvation was declared at first by the Lord, and it was attested to us by those who heard. God also bore witness by signs and wonders and various miracles and by gifts of the Holy Spirit distributed according to his will. Now the interesting thing is in verse 3, you have three generations. You have the Lord, you have those to whom the Lord spoke about this salvation, tested to us by those who heard the Lord, and it was attested to us, the third group, by those who heard the Lord. And it was attested by signs, wonders, and miracles as the confirmation. This is, by the way, one of the verses that makes it very unlikely that Paul would have written it. Paul would not have distinguished himself from those who'd heard the Lord directly and done signs, wonders, and miracles. This is somebody after that. So this is not an apostle who's writing this book. And that raises all the interesting questions about who did write it. And the answer is, we don't know. And your guess is as bad as mine, because that's all we have related to that. So when Paul is talking about the signs of an apostle, and he's talking about these miracles, he is saying that in some way, the miracles that took place were attestations of his special calling by God. Now, the other thing that becomes significant, and Paul also says this in Corinth, and it's interesting, this is in the first in the first book to the Corinthians, because he's talking to people who declare that they have the gift of prophecy. And he says to them in this particular way, because of the issue related especially to women and the role that women should have. He says, was it from you the word of God came? Are you the only ones to whom it's reached? If anyone thinks he's a prophet or spiritual, he should acknowledge that the things that I am writing to you are a commandment of the Lord. If anyone does not recognize this, he is not recognized. Now, the point of that is that an apostle's revelation from God has authority over all other revelation, and it is the final word of revelation. So, a prophet had seen the risen Christ, been commissioned by the risen Christ, been attested by miracles, and given authoritative revelation, so that Paul will write in Acts chapter 2, verse 20, the church is built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets. And that becomes the basis upon which the church is built. So his claim here, even though he's just making a statement in passing, has all kinds of larger significance to it in terms of how we view an apostle, who is an apostle, what the authority of an apostle is, which trumps any other claim. Isn't it interesting how Trump's is always, every time I use it, I think, no, that's not the connotation I want it to have. But it trumps any other claim to authority. And it becomes the final word, so that they must submit to that, because this is a message received from the Lord. Now, it's worth stopping there and seeing what observations you have or any questions you have as we think about, first of all, this whole boasting foolishness thing, and now this statement, I'm not less than them. As a matter of fact, although he doesn't say it at this point, they're not apostles at all, but I'm an apostle, and you saw the authenticating signs indicating the authority that God had given to me. So, any observations or insights that we should make at this point?
So you can say then there are no apostles, true apostles exist today, because I don't know anybody up in Reading who's seen the risen Christ.
So here's where I'll make some distinction. The term apostles was used, if you remember, in chapter 9 or 8, at the end of chapter 8, it talked about Titus and these two brothers who were coming, and they are apostles of the church. So they are messengers of the church. So in that secondary sense, you could still say when you send out a missionary, he's a missionary. But when Paul is talking about the gift of apostle in book of Ephesians, or when he's talking about the gift of apostle in the book of Corinthians, he's talking about the apostles of Christ. There are no apostles of Christ present today. And to use the term apostles in any other sense, and you'll have, especially in charismatic circles, they'll talk about the apostle they mean the pastor of the church, but he likes that title more. That's a claim to authority that they don't possess. So, in a technical sense, you could still use the term apostle today, but not an apostle of Christ in the sense of the 12 who were the foundation, who were giving. And then you also have the statement in the book of Jude when he says, I want to talk to you about the faith once for all delivered to the saints. So it's not an accumulating body of information that Joseph Smith can come along and completely add on to, or others who claim prophetic insight and which really kind of trump and bring in new revelation entirely. So.
Did we hear anything from the apostle who replaced Judas? Did he write any books or do anything that we know of? I mean,
no. We know, all that we have is Acts 1, and that's the only mention. But we don't have mention of, I'm not sure what number it would be, 8 of the other apostles in terms of what their later ministry was. You know, we have Paul, we have James, we have John. James got killed fairly quickly, and we have Paul, obviously, as a later one, but we're not told about the others. Sorry, did you?
Peter.
Yeah, I leave Peter out. He's pretty obvious. So, thank you. So, no, we don't. Okay, well, let's look at this next part. It's interesting that the foolishness thing stuck in Paul's throat, and what stuck in the Corinthians' throat was the whole issue of money. So, in chapter 13, in verse 13 of chapter 12, he says, "In what were you less favored than the rest of the churches, except that I myself didn't burden you?" And that goes back to the discussion we had in chapter 11, verses 7 to 11, in which they complained that Paul wouldn't take money from them. That is not the usual complaint that people have toward supporting ministry. But they felt demeaned by that. that he wouldn't allow them to support him. Now, there's a couple of things behind that. First of all, it was the expectation of these rhetoricians that went around and spoke, and they were the rock stars, that they would be making a good living, and people would be so privileged to hear them that they would be glad to pay for the privilege of having, just like even we have today. I mean, people are willing to spend hundreds upon hundreds of dollars to go to a rock concert just to have the privilege of being there. And if you think of them as rock stars in that particular time, and he's saying, you wouldn't let us support you. The second thing was, there was some wealthy people in the church in Corinth, and they felt humiliated that Paul was out mowing lawns for a living. Oh, he was making tents. But think of it today. Think of Malibu, and you've got a guy who goes into start a church in Malibu, and he refuses to take money from the people to whom he's speaking, and he's got some big performers, some heavy hitters in the church, and he's out cutting people's lawns during the week, pulls up in his old truck, gets out his thing, and people say, who's cutting your lawn? Well, that's the pastor of our church. That wouldn't go over too well, would it? I mean, the whole point is, what, you're going to a church where a guy who's mowing lawns is doing do you understand the analogy that I'm trying to make? They felt in some way demeaned by this, and they worked in that society on the whole principle of the patron and the client kind of relationship. And Paul won't have anything to do with it. I will not take money from you. What made it worse, he'd taken money from the Macedonians, because Philippi had sent money down when he came. Paul didn't take money from the Philippians when he was in Philippi, but now he'd left, he would take money. Part of the reason on Paul's part was that he didn't want some people to think that they owned him in a particular way. And that can be a real problem in churches, that people with money will say, if you don't do this, we'll withhold money. And they're used to getting their way when they come with money. And I remember at a certain point in the history when I was at Trinity Church, we did away with any special funds. Everything had to come in, and we would say, you can give toward this particular thing. But after a while, we even used to be that the youth budget was funded directly by gifts that were given. And it became very unfair to the rest, because people with kids in a certain way would put money in here, and the children's ministry wouldn't get what they needed, or in other ways. And we basically, we're not having these separate kind of things where you can build up a silo and have some control over the youth pastor because you're the big giver behind the program. So that's where Paul was. He did not want to do it, but they said, well, you're not treating us equally, because you're accepting money from other churches, even though he hadn't when he was planting it. And so you're treating us like inferiors. And Paul at the end of that verse says, in the most sarcastic way, forgive me for this wrong, which I think is, get over it. Come on, you got to be kidding. He doesn't think it's a wrong at all, but he's loaded with sarcasm that their biggest complaint against him was that he wouldn't take their money. But the false teachers were more than willing to take it. So that's the end of his sort of fool speech, but interestingly, he comes right back to that same subject, again, very closely. So we'll sort of move right into it in this first thing. So, end, fool speech. Now, verse 14. Here, for the third time, I'm ready to come to you. That's misleading the way the ESV has translated it. It's not, he's ready for the third time to come to them. That's probably meant it's, I'm ready to come to you for the third time. Because he'd come when he planted the church, he came when he did an emergency visit, and now he's coming for the third time. So it isn't that I've been ready to come 3 times and now I'm going to do it. It's that I'm ready to come to you for the third time. And that's very clear in chapter 13, verse 1. This is the third time I'm coming to you. So, he's going to come to them. We've already had that in chapter 8 and 9. He's going to complete the collection, or he wants them to complete the collection that they're gathering together, that he's going to take Jerusalem. He sent Titus ahead with this letter, and he sent the brothers who are delegates to get this thing all in order, and he's coming to them again. But, back to the same issue. I will not be a burden, meaning I won't be accepting money from you. I didn't do it before, and I'm not going to do it this time. I won't be a burden. I won't let you give me any money for the ministry that I'm coming. And the reason is, I seek not what is yours, but you. I'm not after the money, I'm after you. I'm not interested in what you can do for me, but what I can do for you. And I'm here to serve you. Now, the motto of the false teachers was, let's get all we can from them. They were in it for theirs, not them. Paul's in it for them, not theirs, if I can put it that way. And he throws out this next statement. Children are not obligated to save up for their parents, but parents for their children. So what Paul is doing is taking a proverb, a kind of normal kind of statement about the way life works, and that is that parents provide for children. That's the way society works. Nobody expects a one-year-old child to be out earning money for the family and paying for all of that. Parents take care of their children. That's the natural order. That's the way it should be. Now, behind it was a statement that he is their spiritual father. He said that in chapter 6, verse 13 of 2 Corinthians. He said in chapter 4, verse 14, I think in 15 of 1 Corinthians, you have many others in Christ, but you only have one Father. I'm your spiritual father, and I don't want a patron-client relationship with you. I want a parent-child relationship with you. And if that's true, then, as he says, I'll most gladly spend and be spent for your souls. And every mother knows what that's all about. I will spend and I'll be spent for your spiritual well-being. I am willing to pour myself out. And any mother who's looked after little children and known what that's like, and that exhausting, self-giving, fathers as well, but not nearly to the same degree as mothers, that whole, I will give everything for you, and I'm willing to be paid out in terms of exhaustion and spent fully of all of my resources. But then, and you hear the hurt coming through when he says, if I love you more or so much, am I to be loved less? How about a little return on my investment? How about a little coming back this other way? And you can sense Paul, who's poured his life into theirs and sacrificed so greatly that they could get the gospel. And he's not like a parent who's trying to make their children feel guilty. He's just lamenting that situation is like this. So all of that's rather straightforward, and then it takes this strange turn in this next one. But granting that I myself didn't burden you, I was crafty, you say, and got the better of you by deceit. There was a smear campaign going on, and these false teachers were saying, oh yeah, he didn't take money from you when he came, but he's got a game playing. And he is now, this collection, he's going to pocket that. And he's got these people coming, and it's not going to go to Jerusalem, it's going to go to Paul. I was crafty. I mean, they were accusing him of being duplicitous and sneaky, and in behind all of this was he was going to enrich himself. Now, straight up, that's absurd. If they wanted to give him money, why would he need to have this pretext? He could have just said, yeah, I'll take it. Take a love offering for me. And we know how that's been misused in Christian circles down through the years. It was one of the major things that the Billy Graham group did when they decided up in Fresno, after they were here in LA, that they would never take up a love offering at the end of an evangelistic crusade. They would take salaries, everything would be documented, and it wouldn't be because, well, those things can be very, very much abused in different ways. So, saying, you thought I was crafty and I've got this and coming, but I mean, the absurdity of it, the tragedy is not that people said that, because there will always be people who will see themselves in the mirror and thinking what they would do on the circumstances and work undercover. The tragedy is that the Colossians believed it, or at least some of them did, that Paul was playing a game. So all that Paul does at that point is ask 3 rhetorical questions. So, did I urge Titus to go and send the brother with him? And that's actually a question in the Greek text. Did I do this myself, or was Titus in this? Did Titus take advantage of you? Did we act in the same spirit as Titus? They knew Titus and they trusted Titus, and they obviously know Titus was not into something like this. Didn't we take the same steps? Aren't we walking the same way? And he doesn't bother anymore. The whole thing is absurd, but it does tell you the kind of things he was battling against. And it's one of the things that is just a reminder that ministry is difficult because sins are real. And pastors are as prone to self-pity and all of these kind of things. But here's Paul, who's poured himself out, and he's dealing with this pettiness and this constant thing. And what he's concerned about is when he gets to Corinth, he does not want to have to take the whip to them. He wants to come and be able to love them and not have to come in a spirit of an angry father who has to discipline them and get things straightened up. And that's what he's going to talk about in the next section. So, that's where we are. Interesting in the various ways it takes us. Any observations that we should make or things that we should notice that come out of what he's talking about in these verses? It is a good reminder that money issues have plagued ministry right from the very start, actually earlier than that, because money ministries plagued Jesus with Judas manipulating funds. And sadly, there's some terrible stories in operation even right now in connected to some circles that I was been connected with related to money. So, sad. Anything we should notice? Okay. Sorry, Amy.
Even though Paul doesn't mention all the people that he would have known in Corinth, he had specific people in mind as he's writing to them as they would receive this. And that's why I'm assuming it can sound so personal in terms of him calling them out, and because there was a relationship. Right?
Yeah, Romans was written from Corinth. So if you read Romans, and the last chapter of Romans has that long list of names of all various peoples there. So a lot of those would be the people to whom this letter is going, including Erastus, the city treasurer, who's part of that. And so, yeah. These are people he knows, and they're people he led to the Lord, most of them, or at least came to Christ under the 18 months he was there. Okay, so we're going to probably 2 or 3 more weeks in 2 Corinthians, and then we're going to take a break after we're finished 2 Corinthians for a few months in the summer, and we'll figure out what's going to happen in the fall.